Welcome back to CTO TV. I am your mental health expert, Spirit, and today we are talking about the way that trauma affects mental health and wellness. You know, when we talk about trauma, we often hear phrases or diagnoses like PTSD, anxiety disorder, depression, but those get thrown around so often without us really being aware exactly what trauma is and how that relates to mental illness. What I want you to know about trauma is that trauma is different for every individual. Sometimes that can look like conflict. Say if I have been in combat and I'm a veteran. Trauma, though, for children can also look like sexual abuse. Trauma can look like their parents being divorced. Trauma can look like an accident that changes the way an individual sees the world. A traumatic event is simply that, something that causes a reaction that changes how a person thinks, feels, and ultimately goes on to behave. If an individual has a trauma that they experience and the right intervention does not happen, there is an event that they can experience known as acute stress disorder. This usually happens within 2 weeks after a trauma. If that acute stress disorder is not addressed, unfortunately, that can go on to develop into a host of other mental illnesses, including post-traumatic stress disorder. Did you know that a child could have post-traumatic stress disorder? It is so much more common than you think, unfortunately. And the hard thing about trauma is that many children are dealing with trauma that you may know nothing about. This may include things like domestic violence in the home. This may include being exposed to things that children should have no exposure to. It's important to talk to our children about what trauma is so that they can be advocates in their own lives. As a mental health expert, I want you to know that children are much more sophisticated and savvy than we give them credit for. Don't be afraid to talk to your children about different experiences that unfortunately they may encounter in their lifetimes, so that not only can they recognize if they may have been exposed to a trauma, but that they can advocate for themselves to seek the help that they need. Unfortunately, we can never know what goes on in the mind of someone else, our children included. And so it's important that we advocate for them and teach them that if they're feeling something that makes them uncomfortable, if they're thinking thoughts that don't feel very healthy for them, they need to know that they can come to us and talk to us about those things, and we will stand in the gap for them and do what needs to be done to help them figure out those thoughts, those feelings, and those behaviors. Trauma is a very real thing. It has the potential to affect the brain in ways that can last a lifetime. A child cannot heal themselves from a trauma. They cannot simply get over a trauma. They will not outgrow the experience of a trauma. It must be healed. I want you to keep that in mind and know that trauma is very real. It will affect the way that a child functions in school. It will affect the way a child functions in the world. And so when it comes to trauma and mental health, make the connection. It's very real, and our children deserve the best.